There are only 3 components left to test. In this one, we're going to test the add expense page together. In the next one, it is going to be your job to completely test the edit expense page component. Now, the reason we're going to go through this one together is because, once again, there are a few new things I do want to show you, and it'll be your job to put those new things into practice for edit expense page in the next one. So to kick things off, let's go ahead and close down all of these files, and I'm going to crack open the new component, the add expense page component. This is a pretty simple one, so there's not going to be a whole lot to it, but there are a few important things I do want to talk about. The first thing I want to do is talk about a feature of React Redux that's going to allow us to simplify the code inside of here just a little bit. Now, the particular code I'm talking about is this right here. Right here, we do 2 things. We call add expense and we call props.dispatch. Now, props.dispatch could easily be a spy. We could just take the unconnected component, we could render it using shallow, we can pass in a spy, and we can make sure it gets called. But this one is a little bit trickier. Here, we are referencing a function that is imported up above, not something that's passed in as a prop. That's going to make add expense page a little harder to test than it needs to be. Lucky for us, there is a function we can define in connect that allows us to do this. Now, we know the first function is map states to prop. So I'm going to go ahead and pass undefined in for that, since we don't need that for this one. The second function is called map dispatch to props. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek at that. So I'm going to set this up, const map dispatch to props. Map dispatch to props is pretty similar to map state to props, though instead of working with the state, it works with dispatch. Right here, I'm going to set it up to be a function, and this gets called with dispatch. So we have access to use dispatch inside of here, and the goal is to return an object. I'm going to return an object. And on here, we define various props, and these props are going to call dispatch. So in the end of the day, we're going to be able to abstract away something like this, and we're going to be able to replace it with something like this, props dot on submit, passing in the exact same data expense. So this is going to be much easier to test than this. So how do we actually get this code to work? Well, we have to set up on submit, and we define that right here, on submit. What are we going to do on submit? All we're going to do is set up an arrow function. We're going to take the expense in and we're going to pass it through right here. We can use the shorthand syntax. I'm going to call dispatch, which gets passed in by connect. I am then going to set up a call to add expense, and I'm going to pass the expense in. So now we have the exact same functionality. We just have a component that is more testable than ever. Now, from here, we can actually tweak this code. So we have a function that just returns an object. We can go ahead and implicitly return this object. I'm going to cut it out, remove the curly braces, add the parentheses, which are necessary when we are implicitly returning an object. Then I'll paste the object in. So now that we have this in place, we just need to use it. I'm going to take map dispatch to props and pass it in as the second argument to connect. Map dispatch to props. We can now remove the commented outline, and there we go. We have a more testable component. Now, if you do want to learn more about map dispatch to props, it is described over in the React Redux documentation. We can Google React Redux. We can head over to the repository page, and once we're on the repository page, we can just scroll down. If we scroll down to the connect documentation, we can see the first one is an optional map state to props. The second one is an optional match dispatch to props. And if we click over there, we can learn more. So right here, they describe match dispatch to props in detail. And what they're describing here is exactly what we just set up over here. It is a way to return your dispatcher functions, allowing you to abstract them away from the component itself. Now, to avoid inline functions, I'm just going to go ahead and switch this over to a class-based component. Class add expense page extends react.component, and we're going to go ahead and set it up with a method that would be on submit. And on submit is just going to run exactly what it used to run down here. I'm going to take the arrow function, copy it, and set on submit equal to the arrow function. Now we do have to use this dot props instead of props for the class-based component, and there we go. Now all we need to do is define render. What are we trying to do on render? We're just trying to render the exact same stuff we were rendering down here. So I can grab the parentheses and everything inside of it and just return that. So I'm going to return Exactly what I just copied, and the only thing we need to tweak is on submit. We no longer define the function in line, which would need to get recalculated on every render. Instead, we just reference this dot on submit. Excellent. So we have this in place, and we can go ahead and save the add expense page component. I can then remove the stateless functional component down below. And the last thing I want to do is export this guy. We want to make sure we can test the unconnected version. So I'll toss an export in front of that class definition. I'm going to go ahead and save this file, create the test file in the test components folder, and then we can knock out a couple of test cases for this one right here. AddExpensePage.test.js. Inside of here, I'm going to start with the usual suspects, importing React from React, importing shallow from enzyme, and the last thing we need for the moment is to import the component we're actually trying to test. I'm going to import the named export, which we literally just set up, AddExpensePage, and I'm going to grab that from right here, going up to directories, that's the source folder, going into the components folder, and in the components folder, grabbing the file, AddExpensePage. Now we can add our first test case, which is just going to be a snapshot test. We can add a test call, should render AddExpensePage correctly. I'm going to pass in the arrow function. Then I'm going to go ahead and render the component. Now, does AddExpensePage expect any props? Yeah, it needs to. We have onSubmit and we have history, which get used throughout. So we're going to make sure to pass those in. And for our purposes, we can put anything we want in those values. And what I'm going to do is just use some spies. So right here, I can set up a couple of spies, const onSubmit equals jest.function. And I'll do another one for const history. Now, history is going to equal an object, and on that object, we're going to define push, which is the one thing we end up using on history. So history.push will equal a jest function, jest.fn. Excellent. So now we have the two things we're going to pass into the component, and we can actually go ahead and render it. Const wrapper equals, we are going to use shallow to shallow render the component, AddExpensePage. Then I'm going to go ahead and pass those things in. So onSubmit is going to get its value from onSubmit defined above, and history is going to get its value from history defined up above. Excellent. So now that everything is getting passed into the component correctly, we actually have the ability to just take a snapshot of that and call this a day. Right here, I'm going to do just that. Expect wrapper to match snapshot. Excellent. Now we can go ahead and save the AddExpense test page. We can take things over to the terminal and see what we get. What are we getting? We're getting one new snapshot. And if we check out that snapshot file, we can take a quick look and just make sure it looks correct. Here, it does look like we are getting everything we might expect. We have the function getting passed into the form. We have our h1 and we have our wrapper div. Now that everything is looking good for this one, the next thing we're going to do is test that when the form gets submitted, both of our spies actually get called and that they get called with the correct information. So getting this done is going to be a little trickier, but bear with me for the moment. We're going to create a new test case down below. Test should handle onSubmit. We're going to set up the function for that test case, and now we're going to kick things off. Now we are still going to pass the exact same stuff in, and we are still going to be rendering. So right here, we can just take this, copy it, and paste it down below. Now that we have the test case set up, we can take things a step further, and what we're going to do is actually call that function. We're going to call the function that gets passed into expense form. So I'm going to use wrapper.find to find it, expense form. Then I'm going to access the prop we're interested in using prop. The one we are looking for defined right here is onSubmit. Then we're going to call it with the data that it would be called with in the real world, which would just be an expense object. Now we don't have an expense object at the moment, but we can just import the fixtures to get one. I'm going to import expenses. I'm going to grab that from, going up a folder, going into the fixtures folder and grabbing the expenses fixtures file. Now we can actually call onSubmit with some real data. I'm going to access one of the expenses. I'll grab the second one with the index of 1. So at this point, what's happened? At this point, we have successfully, or at least hopefully successfully, ran all of this code. So now we can make some assertions, checking that both of our spies were called with the correct stuff. Right here, we're going to get that done. And I'm going to start with history.push. So we're going to expect that history.push, which is a spy, and we're going to expect it to have been last called with, and we're going to expect it to have been last called with the string /. Now we can move on to the other assertion, which is going to be for on submit. Right here, expect on submit to have been last called with. And in this case, we're going to expect it to have been last called with whatever data we happen to pass through, because we know that over here, it just takes the data and passes it through. So all we need to do is reference that expense right here, expenses. And then we are going to go ahead and access the second item. Now that we have this test case in place, we should be able to save the program, and the test suite should indeed be passing, and it is indeed passing. Now, if anything ever changes inside of here, like I redirect to the incorrect page, for example, the test case will fail because the spies will not have been called with the correct data. I'm going to switch it back, and the test case passes. So over here, there's just one more thing I do want to take a quick moment to talk about before we go. That is the fact that we have the exact same 3 lines right here and right here. In some of your test cases, you're going to find yourselves spending a lot of time building up the test case, building up the thing you're trying to test, rather than actually writing assertions. So if you do find yourself with a lot of duplicate code, lucky for you, there is a way that we can create just a single version of this. So over inside of Jest, in the Jest documentation, what we're going to go ahead and do is go over to the globals page. Inside of here, we're going to be looking at some of these lifecycle methods. So these are the first 4. We have after all, after each, before all, and before each. So these do exactly what you might think. After all runs a single time after all of the test cases in a given file complete. After each runs after each test in the test file completes. Before all runs one time before any of the tests run, and before each runs one time before each test case. Using some of these lifecycle methods, we're going to be able to set up the spies and the component, and then each test case can worry about just using those. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that might look like. Right here, what we're going to do is start off with a few let variables. On submit, then we're going to add history, and finally, after another comma, wrapper. So here we are using the comma syntax to define 3 variables, even though we're not giving them any values. So they still are undefined. Now the goal is to actually define these, and we want to define fresh copies before every single test case. So each test case starts with spies that haven't been called and a wrapper that is what it should be when it first gets rendered. So to do this, we're going to be using one of these guys. We're going to be using before each to run some code before each test case. Now all of these functions, they take a function. So we call them and we pass in a callback. So for before each, we just take before each. We pass in a function, and this function is going to run. Jest is going to be the one who calls it before each test case. We can go ahead and inside of here define real values for those 3. And we actually already have those values defined. So what I'm going to do is take these 3 lines, put them inside of before each, and just remove the const part of the definition. We don't want to define a new variable. We want to set values for these ones up above. Now we can actually go ahead and remove those 3 lines from each of the test cases. This one just needs to take a snapshot of the freshly created component, and this one is going to go ahead and do just the things it needs to do. We're going to go ahead and find the function, call it, and then make some assertions. So with this in place, we can now reuse the spies and the wrappers throughout all of our test cases. If I go ahead and save AddExpensePage, we can switch over to the terminal, and once again, our entire test suite is passing, even though we've restructured things. So when we do find ourselves spending a lot of time setting up the test case, it might be a good idea to try to break that out and just do it once. That is it for this one. In the next video, you're going to go through this exact same process for AddExpensePage, although you'll be doing it on your own. So we're going to be doing a little refactoring, adding in map dispatch to props. You're going to be creating the test file and writing a few test cases. Don't worry, I will give you some comments to guide you through the process, but at the end of the day, it is going to be a challenge video. So let's jump over there. I'll see you then.